our introductions. Thank you so much for joining us for the 5th webinar in our Fall and Winter series. The series theme is Trauma and Healing, Teaching and Learning in Today's Climate. Please watch for emails from us and check our website as we continue this series through April. My name is Kim Klett, and I am the Deputy Executive Director for the Educators Institute for Human Rights. EIHR cultivates partnerships among educators globally to create materials and deliver training based on best practices in Holocaust and human rights education. Together, we deliver content and strategies for teaching conflict history and prevention and sustainable peace. Learn more about us at eihr.org. After we end the program and the recording today, after about an hour, feel free to stay on if you have further questions for our guests. We would love to continue an informal discussion for those of you who would like to stay on for a little bit longer. Before introducing our guests today, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement. Since our offices are in Washington, D.C., EIHR respectfully acknowledges the Piscataway and Nacotchink or Anacostan people and the elders both past and present throughout the generations who have stewarded the land where EIHR gathers. To see on whose land you reside, please visit the website that we'll put in the chat box, which is native-land.ca/. And now I would like to introduce today's panelists. So in the summer of 2022, Peter Feigl, his significant other, Jackie Stover, and American teachers Lisa Bauman and Sheila Hansen met in France to embark on a 10-day trip to retrace and film Peter at authentic sites mentioned in his diary. Across France, Peter served as their gracious and tireless guide, interpreter, and interviewee, providing testimony about his experiences over some 80 years, which he will reflect upon today. Our first speaker will be Sheila Hansen, who is a 5th-generation South Dakotan. She has 30+ years of experience as a secondary ELA teacher and librarian, and is currently the school media specialist at Stevens High School in Rapid City, South Dakota. Since 2000, she has been a museum teacher fellow for the USHMM, and from 2007 to 2012, she worked for the USC Shoah Foundation, mentoring teachers in use of digital testimony, presenting at national and international workshops and conferences, and developing multimedia lessons and activities, including the online activity One Man, Two Voices, where she first worked with Peter Feigl. During the 2020 COVID spring and summer, she encouraged and logistically supported Peter's English translation of the French text, which I'm just going to read you the English translation, 1940 to 1944, Deported Children, Saved Children, the Young Jewish Refugees in Gers, which, along with his teenage diary, served as the foundational texts for their travels and interviews in France. Lisa Bauman holds a Master of Science degree in Curriculum and Instruction and has worked extensively in the field of Holocaust education since becoming one of the original Midwest Center for Holocaust Education cadre members in the early 1990s, doing graduate coursework in Holocaust history and pedagogy. As a USHMM teacher fellow and regional educator, Lisa has extensive experience in planning and conducting educational workshops about the Holocaust, leading workshops at multiple universities and school districts for pre-service teachers, current educators, and community members interested in learning more about the Holocaust. She also has presented for the USHMM at multiple national conferences throughout the US, trained educators at Belfer conferences, and mentored USHMM teacher fellows. In the summer of 2022, after her Fulbright Teachers for Global Classrooms field experience in Paris and Bordeaux, Lisa traveled throughout France with Holocaust survivor Peter Feigl, where they revisited the places where he was hidden as a child during the Holocaust. Lisa teaches gifted education at Blue Valley North High School in Overland Park, Kansas, and is a graduate, and she teaches a graduate course where that she created for Baker University called Fostering Conscientious, Courageous Global Citizens. We also have with us, of course, Peter Feigl. He is the only child of Ernst and Agnes Bernstein Feigl. He was born on March 1st, 1929 in Berlin, Germany. Thoroughly integrated into mainstream German society as non-practicing Jews, the family lived comfortably due to Ernst's position as a mechanical engineer in a company with offices in several European cities. This position took the family first to Prague and then to Vienna. Shortly after moving to Austria, Peter's parents had him baptized as a Catholic in the hopes of protecting him from worsening anti-Semitism. The family eventually ended up in France, and when Peter was placed in a children's camp, as his parents attempted to secure US visas, they were arrested by French police. This is when Peter started writing his diary, hoping one day to share it with them. After the war, he learned that they had both been murdered at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Peter will be telling many pieces of his biography today, and I will share his full biography in the chat box for you to peruse. But right now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sheila, and I'm going to get the PowerPoint up for you, and she's going to tell you a little bit about this whole journey. Sheila?
Hello, on behalf of us all, first let us extend our thanks to EIHR, Kate, Kim, and all the others for giving us this platform to share this story and journey. And thank all of you for joining us today. We hope you find this as moving and as important as we do. Each Holocaust survivor is unique, yet elements of commonality or familiarity are often woven within their stories. And this history. Peter's story contains really two distinct levels. His wartime experiences as a hidden child in France, 42 to 44, and also pretty much the second layer is everything since. There has been a lot of time put into by Peter and others in trying to unlock and perhaps elevate the meaning of his diary texts through the last few decades. You can see the first gift we were given is the existence of Peter's diaries at all. They were written secretly and probably forbidden, but Peter was writing them and started when his parents were arrested in Auch, France in August 27th, 1942. And once he learned they were arrested, he started what is basically a letter to his parents. I think these diaries are tremendous in and of themselves. They are a microcosm, they're immediate, they're personal, yet we have to remember that they're frozen in time. The words can't change, but we can sort of understand it deeper by our examination and study of it. If you read Peter's diaries without any context, the text can be oblique and kind of sparse, yet even then some words scream at you with a universal, timeless meaning, while others are just not something we can unlock. We cannot understand. It's of a time, a place, a circumstance that we were not part of. Yet maybe we're all here because we believe it's our duty to try, to learn, to grow in our own humanity. Alexandra Zapruder, the author of Salvage Pages, published in 2002, is how many of us were introduced to the concept of what diaries are and what they aren't. One of the best texts I've ever read or used in my classroom. Just the introduction itself makes us as teachers see through a new lens. My favorite line in Alex's introduction is, "All history begins with fragments." Peter's diaries are indeed a fragment of a much larger picture: the war, his life, his past, his future. And all of that needs to be unlocked along with the diary. As we've talked about, a Holocaust Memorial Museum fellow, but also a former education manager and trainer at the Shoah Foundation in Los Angeles. I understood the power of salvage pages instinctively, also using it in my classroom, but the Shoah Foundation is obviously based in testimony. And so because there was an upcoming workshop, I wanted, and I knew that the teachers were going to get salvage pages, I wanted to give the opportunity for them to sort of merge the two. So looked in the archive, looked through all the diarists, found Peter Feigl's testimony, which was given to the Shoah Foundation in 1997, and started to look at what the diary said and what his testimony said so many years later. And it kind of sparked this idea of this premise initially of what if Anne Frank had lived and given testimony 40 to 50 years later? What would she have said about her diaries? What would she have been? How would she have been the same? How would she have been different? With Peter, and this is a shout out to my amazing former boss, Sherry Bard, and thought partner, we thought, well, let's try this idea of juxtaposing both. So then, though, after that, it really just took off all on its own. It had kind of a life of its own because Peter didn't just have a testimony and a diary. Peter actually had documents. He had all kinds of pieces that we started then to kind of push together and create sort of an interactive experience in One Man, Two Voices. What you're going to see on the next slide, but you're on the right slide, perfect. Go back, sorry. There. Around 2013, as Alex was developing with Yale Press the second edition of Salvage Pages as sort of an interactive book, she was also working with Facing History to create this corresponding website with lessons authored by my colleagues, Colleen, Lisa, and Bonnie, all who were longtime users of Salvage Pages and Peter's testimony, both taped and streaming in their classrooms. So, and I don't think the lessons are available right now, but they're going to be reposted. I think there is some upgrading of the Facing History website. The next slide, that's how kind of we got to this point in America, but we didn't know this, but at the same time, as we were working in America and getting to know Peter and all of the texts and the interviews and things, retired teacher Giselle Polia-Simoji read Peter's first diary and was so moved by it that she had set out to understand its content and its context. A few years later, Peter and Giselle met in Auch, France, since they have been dear friends ever since, working together as she continued to do the research, eventually published an impressive book in French, filled with primary sources. And this, I think, was 2011, called again, Deported Children, Saved Children. Much is devoted to Peter's history and the local history surrounding it. I think what we kind of refer to, and she refers to in her book, is that he had sort of three major rescuers, but she is so special to us because she rescued his evidence. During COVID in 2021, Peter undertook the monumental task of translating the book to English. Could you back up still, please? Thank you. So all the documents directly supporting his diary and entry could be shared to a wider audience. If Peter's translation itself was not work enough, recompiling it into a book in English was no small feat, as both Peter and Jackie, his significant other, proofreader, paginator, could tell you. Peter can tell you more about that if and when you have questions. It's really not widely available yet in print, but we are going to make the attempt to sort of integrate as much of it as we can onto our website, www.annotatehistory.com. But it really was that translation that pushed us into that final push to get us to go to France ourselves and capture all of this as much as we could on film. And I guess you could call it what you will, a journey, a tour, a quest, a pilgrimage, because it really was all of that and much, much more. All right, and then the last slide that I have for you today is about what it is that local authentic sites give us, because it is sort of the point, why do this? Yes, it's a pilgrimage for us, but what is it to everybody else? And so I think by looking at the bullet points, you can kind of see that is part of what we hope to gain from it. The realness of it, the sensory experience of it. We can't all travel to France with Peter Feigl. But today we're kind of starting a journey to share it widely with audiences. And hopefully those teachers can help their students learn about this history in a different way, in a new way, in a sensory way. I just want to say before I turn this over, in France, Lisa was our driver, our camera woman, our blogger. Jackie was our tireless keeper who always seemed to know what we needed, when we needed it. Colleen was back home behind the scenes, working the social media, giving everybody a daily snippet. And various cities were so welcoming and helpful. But Peter, well, Peter was everything. 93, our interpreter, our co-pilot, our guide, our interviewee, and most important of all, our inspiration. So from all of us to you, Peter, thank you. I'm pleased now to turn the program over to Peter and Lisa, who will talk about some of the places we visited and what those places mean to Peter now and what they meant then.
Thank you, Sheila. It was a fabulous intro. So as we go through the photographs from our trip last summer, I will be asking Peter some questions, and he will be telling us everything and guiding us once again through the journey. So this first picture from left to right, you will see Sheila, Jackie, Jean-Michel, Peter, and myself, Lisa. And this is where it all began, in the Ibis Hotel, the airport hotel of Marseille. And this was our first dinner together. Peter and Jackie had just arrived after a transatlantic cruise and some time in Germany, and Jean-Michel joined us. So Peter, could you start off by telling us who Jean-Michel is and how you have kept up your relationship with him all these years?
I'll be glad to. Jean-Michel is a retired Catholic priest living in Marseille. But Jean-Michel, really, I first encountered him when I was in a Quaker-backed summer camp that was managed by Jean-Michel's mother, Madame Cavaillon, Mrs. Cavaillon, who had two children, Jean-Michel and a daughter. The daughter, Malou or Marie-Louise, was about 4 years old at the time and had curly blonde hair. And I described her in my diary, as a matter of fact, because I frequently wound up babysitting her. She kind of took to me. But Jean-Michel was about 2 or 3 years older than Malou, disappeared really from my mind. And back in the 1990s, I was searching for Mrs. Cavaillon, went through every name like Cavaillon in the Marseille area, couldn't discover him. And it was Gisèle Polias-Ojemi, the lady who wrote that French book, who organized for me to speak in Arches one day. I must have been in the 1990, probably 1994, 95 was around that time. Someone came up and spoke to me. I referred them to Gisèle, and subsequently Gisèle came to me and she said, "We've discovered Mrs. Cavaillon's son. He's a priest, he's in Marseille, here's his telephone number." And the next day I called him, and that's how we reconnected. And I've sort of kept in touch with him ever since.
That is fascinating. So as we embarked on the journey in our brown van, the first place that we went was Les Cailloux, where you were telling us a story in this photograph about the time that you were here talking to Germans. And in this picture, we see Sheila filming, we see Jackie on the left, Jean-Michel on the right, and then we see the current manager of this place, which is now a children's educational farm. So this was our first filming on the entire trip. And I would like to know, what was it like for you to be in front of the camera and microphoned? How did you feel talking about your experiences here as a young man all these years later?
Well, it certainly was a strange experience being back in this area some 80 years after the events happened. That building, which was a farm that had been requisitioned by the German by SS back in 1942, when I was there, has a special significance for me. Actually, the home in which I was at that time, across the street from there, was also operated by the Quakers. And I was in that home awaiting incorporation into a group of some 500 children, 500 orphans that were allowed to come to the United States, allowed by the Vichy government to leave and by the US to come in. The ship was supposed to leave from Marseille in late November. So I was sort of marking time there. And there wasn't too much food available. Food was kind of an obsession back in those days. It was strictly rationed. And when the Germans requisitioned that farm across the street and were having a ball in the courtyard and eating and singing, I went over there and began to chat them up. And they invited me to share spaghetti and meatballs. And at one point, a German soldier said to me, "Well, what's a nice young German boy doing in France at this time?" And well, without hesitation, and I don't know how and why, I blurted out, "Shh, don't tell anybody. My father's in the Gestapo, in the secret police." And they said, "Oh, this is very good. That's very good." And I said, "Of course, I've been here since before the war with my father, because I go to school and I'm able to report to my father about everything that my school colleagues or chums are telling me about their parents, and that's helping my father in his work." Well, as a supervisor, the director of the home across the street, of course, saw me there, and he was livid. He was furious when I came back, and read the riot act to me and said, "Are you out of your mind? What, you're endangering all of us," and so forth. "I'm sending you." Anyhow, it's all described in my diary. He sent me away. I begged him to take me back. He did take me back 7 days later. So if you want to know more about it, look in the diary.
Okay. You were definitely thinking on your feet there. Okay, in this next photo, we're at Camp Duvernay, and you can see the guide there showing us around outside and inside. And it was a very hot day that we were there. And one of the things that the guide made it very clear to us was that at the time when your parents were being deported to Auschwitz and they were here at this camp, the French administered the camp, arrested the families, and delivered them for deportation to Auschwitz. They considered people like your parents as undesirables. And if you hadn't been away at camp that summer, at that time, you also would have been arrested and sent to Auschwitz. So Peter, since you were writing your diary and in these ongoing years, you've learned a lot more about what happened to your parents in recent years. What is a discovery about your parents that you were reminded of while we were there going through the museum at Camp Duvernay and getting the tour?
Well, at the time that I wrote my diary back in 1942, Vernay was just another name. It appeared, it came into my life when Mrs. Cavaillon told me that she had received a postcard postmarked from Vernay, in which my mother begged her to keep me, and in which she said that they were located at Vernay. I had no idea what that was. And here, 80 years later, I'm discovering that this is a little godforsaken railway station in the middle of nowhere. And it was a temporary holding camp where the French were assembling all of the people that they had arrested during the raids in August of 1942. And they briefly spent something like a day or two there until they were collected and shoved into a cattle car. One of those cattle cars is at that exhibit site today. And they are, all those French cattle cars are clearly marked 8 horses, 40 men. That's what they were designed for during the First World War. And here they loaded anywhere from 50, 60 to as many as 100 people shoved into one of those cattle cars. And it just made me shudder because I could visualize my father, who was an impeccable dresser, always dressed to go to the opera or what have you. I couldn't just imagine him being jammed in there with these people. It just horrified me, the whole thing, and that's really made me shudder and much more fully get an idea of what my parents must have suffered and gone through at that time.
Thank you. In the next slide, we have pictures from Osh. And on the left, it is the moment when you and Giselle, who wrote the book, first saw each other on our trip. And it was really emotional for us to see this meeting. And then on the right, there's a photo of you in a classroom at the primary school that you attended as a young boy in Osh. And the children there sang a special song for you, and we were all moved to tears. So my question is, how does being in the school and in the streets of Osh, the last town in which you lived with your parents, affect you today? And what parts of our journey together last summer were the most moving for you, and why?
Well, I think that that day in Osh was probably one of the most moving for me, anyhow, of the entire trip. And that is, first of all, here I am in the classroom in which I was in 1941 when I passed my primary school exam in France. That's a very important exam. Without that, you can't continue going to high school. And here were these innocent faces, young faces, singing for me, and I had a great deal of difficulty controlling my from breaking out and then crying out loud. I mean, the tears were running down my eyes, and I was very, very moved by that. And the town of Osh, of course, yes, that is the last place where I saw my parents before being sent to the summer camp. And it was a town where I spent 2 years, and where I had my first year in high school. So it means a lot to me. But as I said, I think the most moving moment, of course, was when this old man here was surrounded by these young cherubic faces singing, not necessarily well, but anyhow singing loud for me. So.
Okay, that was very emotional. And the next slide, we went on a journey with Giselle to Condom, and we saw the Chateau Monteleone. And while we were there, this is the host and the current owner on the far right showing us around the house. And he especially highlighted all the renovations that he has been making to the house. And when he took us up to the 3rd floor where you stayed as a child, what memories did it bring back? And what memories do you have of Mrs. Cavallon and babysitting her children, Jean-Michel and Mary-Louise, who you mentioned in your diary?
That episode in my life is a pivotal one. Getting up into the 3rd floor, I really didn't remember that room as having been the one where I slept at the time. But Chateau Monteleone, this summer camp operated by the Quakers and managed by Mrs. Cavallon, who was a devout Catholic lady and frequently took me to 7 o'clock mass with her. That is the place where one of the most important event in my life was when suddenly my father appeared in the middle of August, had ridden a bicycle, and again, this is described in my diary. No, excuse me, that's not described in my diary because that happened before their arrest. But he arrived there, and I was astonished to see him. He was 54 years old at that time, had ridden a bicycle for nearly 25 miles in a hot summer. He had a heart condition at that point, and he made the trip in order to give me a small pouch, and told me he had to return back to Auschwitz because there was a Jews under the Vichy regime were not allowed to be on the street after dark. So when he disappeared from my view at the crest of a hill, which was right at the entrance to the Chateau Monteleone, I was overcome with that horrible feeling that I would never see my father again, that this was the last time. And later on, a few days later, that turned to be the case. Mrs. Cavallon told me on the 27th of August that my parents had been arrested the previous day. And that was also the day when I began writing my first diary, because she assured me that she was going to organize a novena and I would be able to see my parents again 9 or 10 days later. So I spent some important time later on. Mrs. Cavallon on 3 separate occasions saved me when the gendarmes came to arrest me, and made me sick enough so that the police realized that, well, I was not transportable. I was recorded as untransportable. And she also then hastily contacted the Quakers and begged them to take me off her hands in that summer camp, because the police were going to come back and arrest me as soon as I was well again. And again, this is described in the diary. There was a back and forth. The Quakers finally agreed to take me and include me in a convoy. I had to fill out forms. Under religion, I put down Catholic. The Quakers went back to Mrs. Cavallon. You don't understand. We're trying to save Jewish children, not Catholics. Mrs. Cavallon writing back to the Quakers and saying, no, you don't understand. When the police comes and I show them his baptismal certificate, they tell me it's worthless. So all of what I'm telling you here, some of this is in my diary. Some of it is what Giselle was able to dig up from archives many years later, and the documents are in the book in question here that she wrote and that I've translated, where there are copies of the letter Mrs. Cavallon to the Quakers. There are copies of the form that I filled out where I put down Catholic and so forth. So it's what's in my diary is very well documented subsequently by all of the research that Giselle did.
Yes, and that's one of the amazing things about this, is that there are so many historical documents that go along. So history teachers and English teachers and anyone can really use both the documentation and your diary. In the next slide, we are at Feigl, and when we were there, France was experiencing record high temperatures. It was 104 degrees on the day that we arrived. And the mayor and the deputy prefect in Feigl welcomed you like royalty with a reception for the entire town. The mayor spoke, little children sang, and Geraldine Fry, a teacher whose class has studied your diary in France and whose students you've Zoomed with, was a featured speaker. So when you think about your experiences in this place as a young man, at a time when you were a teenager, what emotions come back to you? And do receptions like this help you? And does it help to erase the pain or the memories associated with this place?
Well, it was Geraldine Fry, that French teacher who by the way, I had met back in 1994, 95, when I was first in Feigl after the war. She evidently arranged this reception, this unexpected reception by the mayor. And it wasn't just the mayor who was there, but also the deputy prefect, And again, a small group of children from one of the schools who were singing for us and so forth. It was equally moving, the whole thing. I certainly hadn't expected to be met by the deputy prefect. The last time prefects dealt with me, it was in writing, and it was on whether or not to arrest me or whether or not to allow me to stay and get me out of the country, out of France, as an undesirable. So Figeac also is very important. I guess in the next slide, you'll hear about my climbing into the bell tower of the church there on the 22nd of May of 1943, 44, excuse me, 44. The German SS group came into town and organized the arrest or detention of all the males, the boys between the ages of 16 and 54 for inclusion into a forced labor detachment. And that is when I found a passage from the courtyard of the high school where I was at the time. I was a boarding student, obviously, since I couldn't go home in the evening. I lived there together with 4 other boys that had come from Le Chambon with me with false identity. But at that point, although I wasn't 16 yet, I was just almost 15 and a half, I had gotten a lot smarter than when I was eating with the Germans in Marseille. And so I decided to hide in the bell tower of the church. I had been occasionally an altar boy there and knew my way in. And that was quite an experience because although I didn't include that in my diary, I somehow remembered that I managed to get from the schoolyard into the church without going out on the street. And again, it was years later, Giselle discovered that it was the principal of that school who ordered us to remain in school because we might be arrested outside. But Peter Feigl, of course, disregarding that, went and climbed into the bell tower and hid up there for 24 hours. And then I saw the boys and the men being loaded onto trucks and taken out of town. So yes, there are a lot of memories in Figeac.
Yes. And in the next slide, we journeyed on to La Chambon. And again, in La Chambon, we were welcomed by another ceremony at the museum that's there. And the director of the museum drove us all throughout the area, including to Les Grillons, where you were living and you were helped by Daniel Trocmé. And while we were there, a woman approached you with her mother who was in a wheelchair. And the mother shared with you that she was a little baby girl who was living there in La Chambon, in Les Grillons, and they were caretakers. And her daughter brought a bunch of pictures with her to lunch, and you were looking through them, and you can see that in the photo on the left, and trying to point out the people that you might remember. And you did keep multiple photos from the time that you were in La Chambon, and we would like to know how you've learned more about those photos and more about the children who were in those photos. And what is it like to be in a museum and see your pictures on the walls in this town, in a place where you had lived? And how is it to walk back through buildings like Les Grillons and think about the memories that you have there?
Well, Le Chambon and the surrounding area, known as the Vivarais area, is something very, very special. I probably could talk for over an hour just about Le Chambon, a village of Protestants in Catholic France, where some 5,000 people in that area saved some 5,000 refugees. Some 3,500 of them were Jewish. And so I was sheltered in Le Chambon for approximately eight months. My first diary was confiscated there, and it ends abruptly on the 1st of February of 1943. And these photographs, that is still a puzzle. I'm still looking to find the answer. Because what happened is that in that village, first of all, I had several pictures, maybe 8 or 10 pictures, group pictures, and none of us owned a camera or had one. And so I don't know who took those pictures. But in addition to that, this is where I and several other boys, the 4 other kids, for instance, who were sent to that high school in Feigl under false identities. Someone in Le Chambon took passport photographs that were necessary in order to manufacture these false documents, identity cards. And somehow, and I don't know why, we kids in the home where we were in Le Chambon wound up with some 4 or 5 extra copies of these passport photographs, and we exchanged them with one another, writing on the back of them in memory of my best friend so-and-so, my first love, and so forth. And why did we get these extra pictures? That still is a mystery to this day. It was difficult to get photographic paper, the chemicals for printing the pictures, and so forth. So I don't know how or why, but I wound up with about 40 photographs from Le Chambon. And foolishly, for some reason or other, I wrote on the back of each photograph, when someone was given a false identity, I would write their false identity name and their real name on the back of the photograph. And last but not least, against definite orders not to take anything that might be compromising with me when I left Chambon, I kept some of these 40, 45 photographs, which I ultimately carried with me into Switzerland and to the United States, and kept them for years and years. And several of these photographs today are part of an exhibit in the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. On the 2nd floor, there's a panel dedicated to Le Chambon, and most of those photographs I provided.
Okay. And that was really an amazing lunch to just be surrounded with the mayor and other people of La Chambon telling stories and asking questions of you. The next slide is at Drancy, which is outside of Paris. And I realized Sheila and I did not go there with you, but we went before we met you in Marseille. And we know that you went there after we split up in Lyon. So what was it like for you to be at that memorial and inside the museum this time? Was it any different this time than the other times that you've been there?
This was about the 4th or the 5th time that I have been to Drancy. The first time I was in Drancy, I think, was back in 1961 or 63. At the time, there was no memorial yet. And Drancy, of course, was the last of the collection centers that the French had created, where all the Jews that were rounded up throughout France over these years were taken and then loaded again onto cattle cars, and the vast majority of them were shipped off to Auschwitz, to the killing center in Auschwitz. I was there again in September, and was able to visit a memorial, a museum memorial that has been created there. It's only been there about 2 or 3 years, and we weren't able to get into it earlier because we were there on a Saturday, and it's usually closed on Saturday. But this, of course, is a huge housing development that had been built in the late 1930s and early 40, and then was used as the collection center. Probably could hold something like 15,000 people that were crammed into rooms there. And there's also a shield listing the names of all the people who have been deported from there. My mother's name and my father's name are listed there. On the upper left-hand corner, you see an excerpt of that. And that center again makes me realize, because part of the exhibit on the right of what you're seeing there, of that monument on the right of that, is another one of those cattle cars. And those cattle cars always bring back the horrible memory of what my parents must have gone through when they were shoved into those cars like cattle and sent to an extermination camp.
Yes, which just seeing you there in that place after having been there, when Sheila and I were there, one of the things I thought about looking at the memorial was that family, the image of the family, the mother, father, and child, the baby, and just the way that your parents worked so hard to protect you. And they made so many choices that saved your life. And seeing their names and thinking about this memorial, and then you being there all these years later because of what they did for you, is just really moving and just incredible.
You see me lighting a candle. I had just lit a candle down to the right of me on that step. Yeah, and so it was very, very moving.
I can only imagine. Well, that concludes my part of the Q&A here with Peter. So I'm going to turn it back over to Sheila. Possibly to talk about what's next, because we have some more plans. And while Sheila's queuing up, I just want to say that this all started because Sheila and I were teaching during COVID, as were many of you teachers out there. And we were going through our own trauma, as all teachers have. And it was a very hopeful thing to think about a time where we could actually travel. And we thought, you know, what if we asked Peter if he would go with us on this trip, and maybe we could see these sites with Peter? Wouldn't that be amazing? Let's ask him. And we've been kind of wondering, Peter, what made you say yes to us?
Well, I have been involved in Holocaust education since 1992 or 93. And on top of that, I enjoy going to France and to Europe. And it so happens that the timing was perfect, because my companion and I, we had planned on going to Europe on about that time, and had booked the Atlantic crossing on a ship. So why not?
I love that. Why not?
Besides, I had worked with Sheila and with Lisa and Colleen many years before, appearing either on Zoom sessions with some of their students, or in person at various other events organized by the Holocaust Museum, or speaking while traveling together with Alexandra Zaputa, and talking about salvage pages.
So I have a follow-up question for you, Peter, and it just goes back to the things you've learned since you first, wrote your diaries and things. And for the longest time, you believed that your parents were probably murdered upon arrival in Auschwitz-Birkenau. But since then, and not very long ago, you've determined that it may have been a little different than that. Would you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yes, again, the things that one can find in archives is just astounding. As I said earlier, my father had heart trouble when he came to visit me in Condon that day. And he was 54 years old at the time. And I frankly had suspected that he probably couldn't have survived the 48 hours that he spent in the cattle car getting from Drancy to Auschwitz. And I discovered in about 8-9 years ago at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, when the archives, the so-called Bad Arolsen archives were made available to the museum, they discovered that there was a record from Auschwitz showing that my father was registered there on arrival on September the 2nd, September the 4th, on September the 4th, and he was assigned a number. He was tattooed with the number 63069, and that they found another record showing that the number 63069 was registered or admitted to a, quote, medical facility in Auschwitz on the 30th of September. And that's the end of the line. So I must assume that on arrival, when they had the selection process at Auschwitz, when my father was asked about his profession and he said that he was a mechanical engineer, he was probably pulled aside and saved, if I can call it that, in order to work in Birkenau, which is where the Nazis had all kinds of industrial manufacturing facilities, but he probably didn't survive much longer. And so he arrived there on the 4th of September, and he, I think, was either dead or died or was killed on the 30th of September. So, but he did spend practically the entire month of September in Auschwitz.
Thank you for sharing that. It just seems like you've learned so many things. Again, the second layer of your diary. Our last slide here before our presentation is done is what's next. And we are already planning our summer of 2023. I like to call it the rest of some of the story because again, it's always evolving, it's always changing, it's always, you know, as long as we're all in this, I think it will always change and there will always be something new. So we would like to meet in Washington, D.C. We would like to spend some time at the museum. We would like to film Peter on the second floor, if at all possible, since so many of those Le Chambon photos are his photos. He kind of is the exhibit in some ways. And then also, you know, the other half of the story is when Peter arrived in America. It is, you know, I guess it's more than just half, most of his life. He has been in America and he has had an incredible career. And, you know, we really want to highlight some of that because really his story is about the boyhood trauma, but it's also about his adult resilience. And he has demonstrated that to us every single day. And we cannot be happier than, you know, learning from him more. And what we hope to do then is to take the footage and perhaps hire, first, I guess, gather money and hire a documentarian, is that how you would say it, to help us create a documentary of this amazing person and this amazing journey. Also, I did not say, Peter, that we want to interview your daughters. That is that's a very high on our list thing. And thank you all for preliminarily agreeing to that.
Yes.
Let me just say that I'm extremely grateful to the four ladies here for their work and for having taken me under their wing, so to speak. And I'm most grateful to you. You've done a superb job, and I'll continue working. I'll continue working with you for as long as I possibly can, because you and the participants here, there's some 50 people who participated. You are the teachers, and it's most important for the teachers to let the world know what happened, to make sure that it never happens again. Thank you all.
And Peter, I just have a follow-up question. Going back to, Lisa started to talk about our theme of trauma and healing, and we have a lot of participants on our webinars who come from Bosnia and Rwanda, places that have had, more recent conflicts. And so just kind of thinking about that, and you've had such a process of going back over the years and learning new things all the time. Is that healing each time? I mean, obviously it never leaves. You're always thinking about it, but does it heal and help a little bit each time?
Well, every new discovery that I make does help me, in the sense that it finishes, it's another piece in the puzzle to make a whole picture. And and I've always had, I guess, a native curiosity. I was always the one in the crowd who said, why are we doing it this way? And I wanted to find out more. And that I was fortunate. It certainly helped me in my career later on. But I also was gifted, I think, with the ability to not delve on the past, just to hate every German. That doesn't heal. You just eat yourself up. So I've had the ability to call it compartmentalize or something. The past is the past. I can't change it. What I do today might help sometime in the future, but I'm also not going to waste my time worrying about what will happen in the future, because I can't change that either. So I consider it a gift. I've been able to live day to day, and hope that tomorrow will be better than today.
Thank you so much. I always learn so much listening to Peter. I'd like to open up in the chat box if any of the attendees have questions that you would like to ask of Peter or of Sheila or Lisa or Colleen, all of whom have worked extensively with Peter over the years. So if anybody has a question, we're getting lots of thank yous, Peter.
And Peter, I meant to pass along Alex Zapruder's regrets that she was unable to join us today. She really had hoped to be here, and events overtook her calendar, but she sends her love and congratulations to all of you. Hopefully we'll be able to bring you all together again at a later date.
Thank you. Give my best regards to Alex, and she also has done a tremendous job in putting together salvage pages. And that's another story on how she got involved in creating salvage pages. So anyhow, I hope she's well.
I just saw one question in the chat box of what surprised you most on this most recent journey to France?
What surprised me most? You do ask tough questions. I really don't know that there's any. I guess that the two elements. One was in Osh, the kids singing for me in that primary school, and it was very, very, very moving. I had such a hard time not bursting out crying out loud. And the other one was when in Feigl, the people who were organizing and guiding me through the church where I had hidden showed me that there was an underground passage. And then once we got into the church, they asked me where's the key to the bell tower. And that had me stumped for a few seconds, and I was looking around and thinking, and then I saw a ledge over in the far corner, And I said, it was over there. And I went there, and sure enough, there was the key. And they handed me the key. So another moving experience you hadn't mentioned, but when I was in Figeac at the time, I was involved in helping the French underground blow up the Ratier factory. So here I was in 1944 helping blow up the place, and 2022 I am being received there by the top management of the company and given a grandiose tour of the place and given a propeller blade as a memory, as a reminder of the event. So that was also very surprising and very memorable.
And I saw two other questions. Were you ever reunited with any of the other children or people from Le Chambon? And then also, did you find out anything else about your mother and what happened to her?
About the children, there were two in particular that I was able to track down. One of them, Paul Fogelman, false name was Paul Feigl, left Le Chambon with me to go to this high school in Figeac as a boarding student. Paul survived because on the day of the German raid, he was in the hospital having his appendix removed. And I didn't discover Paul Fogelman until sometime in I guess it was the early 1960s. He lives in New Jersey. The last time I heard from him was about 2 years ago or so. I guess I ought to give him a call and see how he's doing. And his sister also, I met her. She is that little 4-year-old girl who now was much older, also living in New Jersey. Those are really the two people that were with me at that time. The three other boys, to my knowledge, they wound up in Auschwitz. Although about 2 or 3 years ago, someone called me and asked me if I knew Jean Feigl, and he was one of those. He was the oldest of the group of 5 that left Le Chambon for Figeac. I had been told that he had been sent to Auschwitz. This person thought that that was a mistake. I have a disagreement with that person because the dates that other person was giving me were different from the dates that I have. So I don't know what the status is. As far as what was the end of your question? Sorry, senior moment.
It was about your mother, and did you ever find out more?
As far as my mother is concerned, the records clearly show that she was killed on arrival at Auschwitz. So, as the vast majority, I mean, again, over the years, I discovered the convoy number on which both my parents were, my mother and my father were. It was convoy number 2028 that had left Drancy on the 2nd of September, arrived in Auschwitz on the 4th of September. There's a book that lists all the names in alphabetical order of the I think there were 980 or 990 some people in that convoy. And it also shows, by the way, that some 8 or 9 of them were not gassed on arrival. But what the book doesn't show, that my father was one of them. That's one of the things that I discovered just about 6-7 years ago at the Holocaust Museum in the archives.
Thank you.
I'll be glad to answer any questions that anyone might have. I noticed you have some people on chat, 89 chat questions.
Yes. I think I captured them all, but Sheila, Lisa, Kate, Colleen, if anybody noticed any others, feel free to grab those. And I am going to stop the recording.
And I want to thank all of the people who have participated in this program. Thank you.
Yes, thank